Hello everyone. Today I'm going to create a stopwatch using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. On the screen, you will see the total time displayed in hours, minutes, seconds, and milliseconds. We have 3 buttons: Reset, Start, and Pause. To start the timer, simply click the Start button. Once you do, you'll see the milliseconds and seconds begin to increase. We also have a Pause button. When you click it, the timer will pause, stopping the hours, minutes, seconds, and milliseconds. The Reset button allows you to clear the time. When you click it, the timer resets to 0. Additionally, the Reset button will change to a blue color and show a shadow effect. When you click Start again, the stopwatch will resume counting. If you click Reset, it will clear everything, including the start and pause states. This is the functionality of our stopwatch. Let's create this in our video. Okay guys, so this is HTML code in Visual Studio Code. Don't forget to link the CSS using this line of code. Next we have script.js, so make sure to link it as well using this line of code. Alright, now let's take a look at the CSS. This is the startup code for CSS, and you can copy this code. As for script.js, there's no code yet, it's completely empty. Okay, so this is the startup code. Now let's move on and start writing the actual code. Okay, let's create some of the main elements. First, we will create the main element and give it a class name of container. Inside the main container, we will add a timer using the h1 element and assign it the class name timer. Inside the heading h1, we will create the following time components: hours, assign it an ID of hour, and initially set it to 00. Each time unit will be separated by a span containing a colon, just like before. Also create for minutes, seconds, and milliseconds. Okay, the time HTML structure has been created. Next, let's creating the buttons below the timer. We will create 3 buttons, each with a unique functionality. The buttons will be placed inside the timer container. Set the Reset button ID to Reset button. The Start button ID to Start button. And the Pause button ID to Pause button. Next, let's move on to styling. Don't forget to link the CSS file to your HTML document. Now let's style the body element. Set the width and height to 100% to ensure proper centering. Use Flexbox to center everything in the middle of the screen. Use Display Flex to ensure the child elements are centered. Set the width and height to 100% to ensure proper centering. Next, let's style the container. Style the timer. Add some padding to make space between the timer and buttons. Use gap to create spacing between elements. Add a border radius to smooth the edges. Apply a box shadow to make it look better. Increase the font size to 3 rem to make the numbers more visible. Add some gap for spacing. Style each time unit inside the timer. Set a fixed width to prevent the size from changing when the numbers update. Align the text to the center. Alright, now that the timer is done, let's move on to styling the buttons. First, we'll add a border so we can clearly see the buttons area. Next, we'll set display flex so we can add some spacing between the buttons. Now, let's duplicate the buttons and replace them as needed. I'll style each button by setting its width to 100%. Then, I'll add some padding to give the button some height. I'll remove the border by setting border. To make the buttons look better, I'll add a border radius. I'll also set the font weight to 600 for better text appearance. Now if you notice, the cursor isn't showing up properly. To fix that, I'll set cursor pointer, so the pointer changes to a hand when hovering over the button. Next, let's add an animation when the button is clicked. I'll apply a transform. Scale. Effect to create a clicking animation to make the animation smooth. I'll add a transition effect. Don't forget to set the transition easing to ease for a more natural effect. Now let's declare the class for the active button. The first active button will be the Start button. I'll give it a blue background and set the text color to white. To enhance its appearance, I'll add a box shadow. Now that the active button styling is done, here's the final CSS. Alright, let's move on to the script.js code. Alright, now let's start the script. First things first, we want to make sure everything is working. So let's begin by clicking the Start button. Now let's import the necessary elements. Starting with the Reset button, we'll retrieve each button by its ID and ensure they are properly imported into our JavaScript file. Next, let's handle the Start button. We'll add an event listener for the click event. When clicked, it should call a function named Start. Let's create the Start function and add a console.log statement to verify that it works correctly. Now let's inspect the browsers, go to the console and test it. When we click the button, we can see that the function is working properly. Next, let's create another function for the Reset and Pause button. With all our functions in place, let's now focus on creating the Start function. To track time, we need an interval. We'll declare a variable interval and set its initial value to null. Now let's set up the interval using setInterval. Inside this interval, we'll create a loop that updates every 10 milliseconds. To verify, we'll add a console.log start. You can see that the interval is looping very fast. Now let's set the interval to update every 10 milliseconds. Next, we need variables to store time values: millisecond, second, minutes, and hour. Every time the interval runs, the milliseconds value should increment. Let's test this by logging milliseconds in the console. You can see that the milliseconds increment every 10 milliseconds. We need an if condition. If milliseconds reaches 99, we should reset milliseconds to 0 and increment seconds by 1. Let's test again. We can see that when milliseconds exceed 99, the seconds increase accordingly. We need to update the display. Let's create a function called updateDisplay and call it inside the interval. This function will update the timer display every 10 milliseconds. Now, to update the UI text, we need to import its text ID into the JavaScript code. Okay, now let's import each text ID for time, such as nearly a millisecond, second, minutes, and hours. Okay, now every time we import the text, let's update the milliseconds inside the updateDisplay function. The millisecond text will be updated based on the millisecond data value. Let's click the Start button again. Now you can see that the milliseconds text has updated. However, the number doesn't look good because when it's below 10, it doesn't show a leading 0. To fix this, we need to use a ternary operation to check the condition and add a 0 before numbers less than 10. This code means if the milliseconds are below 10, add a 0 in front. If not, just display the milliseconds. To duplicate the code, press Alt plus Shift plus down. Adjust it accordingly to match the others. Okay, the time UI update is now working properly. Let's copy the code again, then select the text and press Ctrl plus D to change all similar occurrences at once. Okay, now the updateDisplay function inside the code is done. Next, let's create another if condition for handling minutes and hours. Now let's test the minute and hour by changing the minute and hour value. Okay, as you can see, the minutes and hours are updating correctly. That's good. Now let's test the pause function. The pause button isn't working because there's no code inside the pause function. So let's add clear interval and pass interval as the parameter. You can see that when we call clear interval, the interval is cleared with this code. Now when we click the pause button, the timer will stop because the interval is cleared. Let's copy the clear interval function and use it in the reset function as well. I'll add a comment for clear interval to make the code more readable. In the reset function, I have added a comment, reset all time values to 0. Now let's reset all the time data to 0. Let's copy all the time-related data and paste it inside the reset function. Don't forget to remove the let keyword and set the values to 0. Okay, now when I click the reset button, the timer stops. However, when I click the start button again, the timer resets to 0 instead of continuing. This problem happens because we didn't update the display when the reset button was clicked. To fix this, we need to call update display after resetting the time data. Now, let's test it again. When we click the reset button, the UI updates to 0 correctly. Okay, but now there's another bug. When we click the start button more than once, the timer runs too fast. This happens because the setInterval function is being executed multiple times, causing it to duplicate. To fix this, let's add an if condition. If interval already has a value, we simply return to prevent the code from running again. Let's test it again. Now when we click the start button, the bug is gone. However, there's still another issue. If we click start, then pause or reset, and then click start again, the timer doesn't start. This is because of the if condition checking the interval value. To fix this, let's set interval equals null when pausing the timer. Now let's test again. When we press the start button again, everything works correctly. Great! The timer functionality is now complete. The last step is to change the button color when clicked. Let's create a new function called change button color. Now let's copy the function name and paste it inside the start function, passing start as the argument. Now let's copy the change button color function to the pause inside and reset functions as well. We can get the button name value from the function parameter button name. Next, let's add a class to the button using the button name argument. We take button name, add button with a capital B, and use this to target the correct button when clicked. Just like an ID, the parameter name is button, and we add button with a capital B. Then we'll use ClassList.add to add the class ActiveButton. Copy this part. Now let's test the code. You'll see that when a button is clicked, it becomes active and turns blue. However, there's a problem. Every clicked button stays blue. Instead, we want only the currently clicked button to be active. To fix this, we need to remove the ActiveButton class from all buttons before applying it to the newly clicked one. Let's do that by resetting the active class for each button. Now, let's test it again. You'll see that the active button functionality is working correctly. And that's our final JavaScript code. Alright guys, this is the final result of our stopwatch, built using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript on a website. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this. Thanks for watching.